Imagine for a moment that you are standing beside a great river. People are gathered all along its banks. Some are shouting their names into the current, carving messages into the rocks, throwing bottles with notes inside, hoping that the river will carry some trace of them forward. Others are busy photographing the river, narrating their presence beside it, making sure that anyone who passes by later will know, I was here, I saw this, I felt that. And then, slightly apart from all this activity, there are a few people who simply sit. They watch the water move. They listen. They do not announce themselves to the river, nor do they attempt to capture it. They are there, but quietly so. Now, in our time, social media has become something like that river. It is a vast, flowing stream of images, opinions, confessions, celebrations, outrage, and longing. To post is to step forward and say, here I am. This is what I think, this is what I feel, this is what I look like, this is what matters to me. And it seems on the surface that this is what human beings naturally want to do. After all, we are social creatures. We seek recognition, resonance, and response. So when we encounter someone who does not post, who does not participate in this public performance of self, we may feel puzzled. Are they hiding? Are they indifferent? Are they superior? Are they lonely? Are they missing out? But the psychology of people who don't post on social media is not a single story. It is a landscape, subtle and varied. And to understand it, we must first question a very deep assumption, that expression must always be external, and that existence must always be validated by being seen. There are those who do not post because they are not particularly interested in turning their inner life into an object. For them, an experience is something to be lived, not displayed. When they laugh with a friend, the laughter is complete in itself. When they travel, the journey does not feel unfinished without proof. When they suffer, the pain is not automatically transformed into a narrative. This does not mean they lack depth or emotion, quite the opposite. It may mean that their relationship to experience is immediate rather than representational. They are not standing outside their lives curating them. They are inside them. You see, social media subtly encourages a split. There is the one who lives and there is the one who watches the living and prepares to show it. For many people, this split becomes habitual. One is never simply eating, one is eating for later. One is never simply thinking, one is thinking for posting. But some people feel this split as a kind of tension or even violence to their sense of wholeness. They do not want to turn themselves into a product, even a very personal one. So they step away, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of self-preservation. There are also those who do not post because they are deeply sensitive to the invisible audience. To speak into a room of millions, even an abstract room, can feel overwhelming. Every post invites interpretation, misinterpretation, judgment, comparison, and response. For some minds, this constant openness triggers anxiety rather than connection. They imagine the many eyes, the many possible reactions, and instead of feeling expanded, they feel exposed. Silence, in this case, is not emptiness, it is shelter. And then there are those who have looked closely at the economy of attention and found it strangely unsatisfying. They notice how easily one's sense of worth can become entangled with numbers, likes, shares, views, followers. They may have felt the small thrill of recognition, followed by the subtle crash when it fades. They may have noticed how the mind begins to ask, almost unconsciously, how will this be received? Instead of, is this true for me? At a certain point, they step back, not because they think attention is evil, but because they see how easily it can hypnotize. For these people, not posting is a way of refusing to measure their existence in public units. It is a quiet decision to let meaning arise privately, in conversations, in work, in thought, in silence. They may still enjoy connection deeply, but they prefer it uncounted. It is also worth noticing that some people who do not post are not withdrawing from society at all. They are simply engaging with it differently. They may be deeply involved in their communities, their families, their creative projects. They may talk for hours, listen carefully, and show up consistently. Their absence online does not mean absence in life. In fact, it may reflect a trust in presence rather than representation. They understand intuitively that not everything real leaves a trace. Psychologically, this can be linked to a stronger internal locus of validation. Their sense of I am does not depend as heavily on external mirrors. This does not mean they are immune to insecurity. No human being is. But it does mean that their identity is less entangled with performance. They are less inclined to ask, how do I appear? And more inclined to ask, what am I experiencing? The center of gravity is slightly shifted inward. Of course, not all silence is serene. Some people do not post because they feel they have nothing worth saying, or because they fear rejection, or because past attempts to share were met with indifference or hostility. For them, non-posting may be a protective response to hurt. And yet even here, the psychology is revealing. It shows how deeply social media has intertwined expression with judgment. To remain silent can feel safer than to risk being misunderstood, ignored, or attacked. But there is another, subtler dimension. Some people sense that social media accelerates the mind. It encourages quick opinions, instant reactions, and compressed emotions. They notice that their own thinking becomes sharper, more polarized, more performative when they engage. To step away is to slow down. It is to allow thoughts to ripen rather than rush. These individuals often value ambiguity, nuance, and unfinished understanding. They are not eager to freeze a moment of thought into a public statement that will follow them like a shadow. In this sense, not posting can be a form of intellectual humility. It is an acknowledgement that many things are in process, that not every insight needs an audience, and that some questions are more alive when left unanswered. There is also the simple pleasure of privacy. In a world where so much is shared, privacy becomes precious. People who do not post often enjoy having parts of their lives that are known only to a few, or only to themselves. This is not secrecy in a dramatic sense, but intimacy. It is the difference between telling a story to a close friend and announcing it to a crowd. The faux RMR allows for vulnerability without spectacle. Interestingly, these individuals often experience time differently. When you are not documenting, time feels less fragmented. Moments flow into one another without the interruption of self-reference. A meal is not divided into before posting and after posting. A thought is not interrupted by the urge to broadcast it. There is a continuity that feels grounding, even nourishing. From a broader psychological perspective, people who don't post often resist the construction of a fixed narrative self. Social media profiles tend to solidify identity. This is who I am, this is what I believe, this is my aesthetic, my stance, my story. But human beings are more fluid than that. Some people feel uncomfortable pinning themselves down. They sense that identity is a process, not a brand. By not posting, they allow themselves to change without explanation. And yet, we must be careful not to romanticize silence or pathologize expression. Posting and not posting are both human responses to the same fundamental longing: to be real, to be connected, to matter. The difference lies in how that longing is met. For some, sharing outwardly feels natural and enlivening. For others, it feels like dilution. What is fascinating is how people who don't post are often misunderstood. Their silence is interpreted as absence, disinterest, aloofness, or even judgment. But silence is not necessarily empty. It can be full of observation. It can be full of listening. It can be full of a life that is being lived rather than narrated. In a way, these individuals remind us of something ancient, that not everything meaningful is visible, that awareness does not need applause, that depth does not require an audience. They stand, metaphorically, by the river, watching it flow, content to let the water pass without carving their names into the stones. And perhaps the most intriguing psychological aspect is this: people who do not post often experience themselves less as a thing and more as a happening. They are less inclined to objectify their own thoughts and feelings. Instead of saying, "This is my identity," they live as a movement, a response, a presence. Their sense of self is less rigid, more like weather than architecture. There is also a curious relationship these individuals have with boredom. In a culture where any idle moment can be filled by scrolling, posting, reacting, and refreshing, Those who do not post often rediscover boredom as a doorway rather than a problem. When nothing is being shared, something else begins to speak. The mind wanders, memories surface, questions arise without immediately being shaped into opinions. This can feel uncomfortable at first because boredom exposes the raw texture of consciousness. Yet for many non-posters, this exposure becomes familiar, even valuable. It is in these unoccupied spaces that creativity quietly gathers itself. Not for display, but for its own sake, psychologically. This suggests a tolerance for inner noise. People who don't post often allow thoughts and feelings to exist without immediately translating them into language. They are not in a hurry to explain themselves, even to themselves. This can make them appear reserved, but internally there may be a rich, ongoing dialogue that does not seek punctuation. Their silence is not the absence of thought, it is thought without exhibition. Another aspect worth noticing is how these individuals relate to memory. When experiences are constantly documented, memory subtly shifts. One remembers not only the event, but the image of the event, the caption, the reaction it received. Memory becomes layered with representation. For those who do not post, memory remains more porous, less fixed. An event can change over time, acquiring new meanings as it is remembered differently. There is less pressure to keep the story consistent. Psychologically, this allows the past to remain alive rather than archived. There is also a different relationship to disagreement. Social media tends to amplify conflict, not necessarily because people disagree more, but because disagreement is made public, permanent, and performative. People who do not post are often less invested in winning arguments in front of an audience. They may still hold strong views, but they are less inclined to turn those views into banners. This can make their thinking more flexible. Without the need to defend a public stance, they are freer to change their minds. This does not mean they are disengaged from the world's problems. Many are deeply concerned, even troubled, by social, political, and cultural issues. But they may choose forms of engagement that are less visible: private conversations, local action, careful study, or simply sustained attention. For them, caring does not require broadcasting. Concern does not need to be signaled to be sincere. It is also interesting to observe how people who don't post experience relationships. When communication is not filtered through constant updates, relationships often become more intentional. You don't know what someone is thinking unless you ask. You don't know what they are doing unless they tell you. This creates a different rhythm of connection, one based on inquiry rather than assumption. Psychologically, this can deepen listening. Conversations become spaces of discovery rather than confirmation. There is, too, a subtle resistance to comparison. Social media invites us to line our lives up side by side, to measure success, happiness, beauty, productivity. Even when we know intellectually that what we see is curated, the emotional impact remains. People who do not post, and often do not scroll much either, are less exposed to this constant comparative pressure. Their sense of progress is more idiosyncratic. They may feel behind by some standards, ahead by others, but these evaluations are quieter, less relentless. From the inside, this can feel like rely. The nervous system is not being constantly stimulated by other people's highlights. There is more space to notice one's own pace. Psychologically, this supports a form of self-trust. One learns to ask, does this feel right? Rather than, how does this look? Another layer emerges when we consider identity formation. For younger people especially, social media can function as a mirror that speaks back very loudly. It tells you which parts of yourself are applauded and which are ignored. People who don't post grow up with a different kind of mirror. Feedback still exists, but it comes from embodied interactions rather than metrics. This can make identity feel less polished, but also less constrained. They may experiment inwardly for longer before presenting themselves outwardly. This inward experimentation often produces a comfort with ambiguity. They do not rush to define themselves in terms of labels, aesthetics, or affiliations. Psychologically, this suggests a self that is exploratory rather than declarative. The question, who am I, is allowed to remain open, not as a problem to solve, but as a process to inhabit. There is also the matter of energy. Posting requires a certain outward push, selecting, editing, framing, anticipating response. For some people this is energizing, for others it is draining. Those who don't post often conserve this energy for activities that feel more immediate: reading, building, thinking, caring. They are not necessarily more disciplined. They are simply allocating attention differently. And attention, after all, is one of the most intimate expressions of psychology. We might also consider the way these individuals relate to authority. Social media tends to flatten hierarchies of voice, but it also creates new ones based on visibility. People who don't post are often less influenced by these emergent authorities. Their opinions are shaped more by direct experience, long-form engagement, or trusted individuals rather than trending narratives. This does not make them immune to influence, but it changes its texture. Influence becomes slower, more personal.
Certain irony here.
In choosing not to post, these individuals are often more influenced by fewer voices, but those voices carry more weight. Psychologically, this can lead to depth rather than breadth. They may know less about what everyone is saying, but more about what a few people are actually thinking. And then there is solitude, not loneliness, but solitude. People who don't post often cultivate an ability to be alone without feeling incomplete. This is not always comfortable, and it is not always chosen, but it is familiar. Solitude becomes a place where one can exist without commentary. Psychologically, this strengthens the capacity to self-regulate, to sit with emotions without immediately seeking distraction or validation. In this solitude, there is often a heightened sensitivity to the present moment. Without the impulse to captain, or share, perception can become more vivid. Sounds are sharper, textures more noticeable, conversations more absorbing. Experience is less mediated by the question of what it will become later. It simply is. And this immediacy can feel quietly profound. Some people who don't post describe a sense of invisibility, but it is not always negative. Invisibility can be a relief. It allows one to move through the world without being constantly reflected back. Psychologically, this can soften the ego. Without an audience, the self does not need to perform. It can rest. Of course, this invisibility can also become a challenge. In a world that increasingly assumes online presence, those who don't post may feel misunderstood or overlooked. Their absence can be interpreted as disengagement. This requires a certain resilience, a willingness to be known more slowly, or perhaps not at all by many. Psychologically, this asks for patience and sometimes courage. What emerges again and again is that not posting is rarely about technology alone. It is about a relationship to self. It reflects how one experiences meaning, attention, validation, and connection. It reveals whether one feels more at home in expression or in awareness, in display or in participation, in narration or in silence. And as we continue to observe this quiet minority, we may begin to notice something subtle but important, that their way of being does not oppose social media so much as it exposes its assumptions. T asks, without speaking, whether life must be turned outward to be real, whether moments lose their value if they are not shared, whether identity must be continually affirmed to exist. These questions linger, not as criticisms, but as open spaces. And in those spaces, the psychology of people who don't post continues to unfold, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing, living inquiry. This inquiry becomes even more interesting when we notice how these individuals experience success and failure. In a highly visible culture, success often feels real only when it is acknowledged, and failure often feels heavier because it can be witnessed. People who don't post tend to experience both in a more private register. Success may arrive quietly, without announcement, and be digested slowly, without applause. Failure may be processed without the added weight of public narrative. Psychologically, this can create a steadier emotional rhythm. Highs are less inflated, lows less theatrical. There is also a difference in how desire operates. Social media constantly presents us with images of what could be wanted. Lifestyles, bodies, achievements, opinions, Desire is stimulated, redirected, refined, and multiplied. People who do not post and often consume less as well encounter desire more intermittently. They want what arises naturally from their circumstances rather than what is repeatedly suggested. This can make desire feel simpler, though not necessarily easier. It is less crowded by comparison. Another subtle factor is how these individuals relate to language. Posting encourages language that is quick, declarative, and optimized for reaction. People who don't post often allow language to remain more tentative. They may speak in longer sentences with more pauses, or they may speak less but listen more. Internally, their thinking may be more imagistic, more sensory, less compressed into slogans. Psychologically, this preserves a certain elasticity of meaning. Words are tools, not badges. This elasticity extends to emotion as well. When emotions are posted, they are often crystallized: joy, anger, grief, pride. But emotional life is rarely so clean. People who don't post may feel emotions in their mixed, ambiguous forms. Sadness may be tinged with relief, happiness with fear, anger with compassion. Without the pressure to present emotions clearly, they can remain honest. This honesty is not necessarily comfortable, but it is intimate. We can also observe how these individuals experience time in relation to aging. Social media often freezes people at particular moments: a look, an era, a version of self. People who don't post age more invisibly. Change happens without documentation. This can reduce the sense of loss that comes from comparing who one was to who one is now, side by side, on a screen. Psychologically, this allows aging to feel more like a flow than a series of before and after contrasts. There is also a quieter relationship to legacy. Posting often carries an implicit question: what will remain of me? People who don't post may hold this question differently or not at all. Their sense of continuity may lie in influence rather than record, in the way they affect others rather than in what they leave behind online. This can feel less secure, but also less heavy. Legacy becomes something lived, not archived. Another dimension appears when we consider humor. Online humor is fast, referential, and often dependent on timing and context. People who don't post may enjoy humor that is slower, situational, or private. A shared glance, an inside joke, a moment that dissolves as soon as it appears. Psychologically, this kind of humor strengthens bonds without leaving evidence. It belongs to those who were there. There is, too, a difference in how these individuals experience authority over their own stories. On social media, stories are open to commentary, reinterpretation, and appropriation. People who don't post retain more control over how their experiences are understood, simply because fewer people are involved. This can foster a sense of ownership over one's narrative, even if that narrative is rarely spoken aloud. At the same time, this ownership is flexible. Without a public version to maintain, stories can be told differently to different people. One can emphasize joy in one context, confusion in another. Psychologically, this allows the self to be relational rather than fixed. Identity becomes something that emerges between people, not something broadcast to all. We might also notice how these individuals respond to novelty. Social media thrives on the new trends, new takes, new outrages. People who don't post are often less reactive to novelty. They may approach new ideas cautiously, letting them settle before responding. This does not mean they are conservative or resistant to change. It means they prefer digestion to immediacy. Psychologically, this supports integration rather than fragmentation. There is an interesting paradox here. By not participating in the constant exchange of information, these individuals sometimes develop a deeper understanding of fewer things. Their knowledge is not as wide, but it is often more embodied. They learn through experience, repetition, and reflection rather than exposure alone. This kind of knowing is slower, but it has roots. Another area worth exploring is vulnerability. Posting can be a form of vulnerability, but it is often structured and controlled. People who don't post may express vulnerability in less visible ways, in one-on-one conversations, in actions rather than words. in moments that are not recorded. Psychologically, this can feel riskier because there is no buffer of distance or audience, but it can also feel more real. And then there is the question of silence itself. Silence is often misunderstood as absence of communication, but psychologically, silence is a form of participation. To be silent in a noisy world is to choose where one places one's energy. People who don't post are not necessarily quieter inside, they are simply selective about where sound becomes speech. This selectivity often reflects a respect for attention, both their own and others. They may feel that not everything needs to be said, and certainly not everything needs to be said to everyone. This is not censorship, it is discernment. Psychologically, discernment suggests a mature relationship with impulse. The urge to express is felt, but not automatically obeyed. As we continue to sit with this, it becomes clear that people who don't post are not outside the culture. They are responding to it in a particular way. Their psychology is shaped by the same forces as everyone else, but filtered through different values. They are not rejecting connection, meaning, or expression. They are exploring them through quieter channels. And in this quiet, something continues to unfold. An ongoing adjustment between inner life and outer world, between what is felt and what is shown, between the richness of experience and the simplicity of letting it be. So, when we look at people who do not post on social media, what we are really looking at is not a lack, but a different orientation toward life. Their silence is not an empty space where expression should be, it is a full space where experience is allowed to breathe. It shows us that the self does not require constant reflection to exist, and that awareness does not need witnesses to be real. In noticing them, we are gently invited to question our own habits, not to abandon expression or condemn technology, but to ask where our attention truly lives. Are we inhabiting our moments or preparing them for display? Are we listening to our inner movements or translating them too quickly into public language? The presence of those who do not post quietly reminds us that there is another rhythm available, one in which meaning arises without announcement. Ultimately, this is not about choosing silence over speech or privacy over sharing, but about remembering that both are possible and both have their place. Life can be lived as a performance, and it can be lived as a participation. For some, the deepest sense of connection comes from being seen. For others, it comes from simply being. And in recognizing this, we may rediscover something easily forgotten, that our worth is not measured by our visibility, our reality is not dependent on confirmation, and our lives remain profoundly alive, whether or not they are ever put into words.